So nice to see you all at this session. What are the potential risks and rewards of gene editing in sustainable food and farming? I'm Brendan Costello. I'm Director of Policy and Strategy at the Soil Association. So why are we all here and what's this all about? Up until 2023, gene editing, otherwise known as precision breeding, was covered by relatively strict regulations that were there to govern the use of genetically modified organisms. However, the government, through its Genetic Technologies Act, removed gene editing from those regulations and decided to put them into a lighter touch framework, which we're yet to see. That was on the basis that this technology allows changes in traits that could, in theory, be delivered through traditional breeding methods and therefore didn't require the same level of regulation. This has proven to be a hugely divisive topic among good people who share similar values. On the one hand, proponents argue that it speeds up the development of crops that can help us deal with lots of the challenges we face in the world, like climate change, biodiversity loss, reduce the need for pesticides, reduce the need for fertilizers, and increase food security and enable more people to get the nutritious food that they need. On the other hand, there are plenty of people who feel that this is just much like GMOs more generally, a bit of a distraction. It allows people to think that we've got silver bullets coming down the road, and those people that have responsibility and power delay taking some of the difficult choices they need to make to fundamentally change the system to allow us to deliver the sustainable food system, which probably can be delivered if they make those changes, but difficult changes. There are also significant concerns around consumer choice and traceability, and the fact that it would be difficult for people to know whether or not indeed precision-bred organisms are in their food. So it's and actually at the moment it feels like we're way off the public, and indeed retailers being close to wanting PBOs being in food. That's the general feeling we get out there. So it's really complicated. It's very nuanced, both from a scientific perspective, a regulatory perspective, and from an ethical perspective. I don't claim to be an expert in precision breeding, but luckily this panel collectively are experts. And they should be able to inform everybody and deliver a really well-intentioned and interesting discussion. So on my left-hand side, I have Kierra Box from Friends of the Earth. Let me just get on my notes. She leads their work on trade and environmental regs. She spent 8 years working on policy and advocacy relating to Brexit. I feel your pain. You are the chair of GM Freeze, and you also sit on the management committee for the Trade Justice Movement. On my right-hand side, I have Professor Giles Oldroyd from Cambridge University. He studies mechanisms by which plants form beneficial interactions with microorganisms that aid in the uptake of nutrients in the environment. Long-term aim is to reduce the reliance on inorganic fertilizers. I think that's an objective we definitely all share. He heads up the international program funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Agricultural Innovation, as a director at Crop Science Centre, a fellow of the Royal Society, and a foreign member of the National Academy of Sciences. To his right, we have George Young, aka Farming George, who is an agroecological farmer from South Essex. He has a very healthy obsession with bringing nature back into his farming system. He's been bringing livestock back into what was previously arable and introducing agroforestry, and has an organic beef suckler herd. And then to his right, we've got Dan Crossley, who is Executive Director at the Food Ethics Council, a not-for-profit company working to facilitate a shift in the food system to make it fairer for people, animals, and plants. He has over 20 years' experience working on food sustainability issues, and he writes an excellent monthly column in The Grocer, which I would highly recommend. So, without further ado, I will pass on to Kierra.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I've got over-enthusiastic. My name is Kierra Box. I campaign for Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland on trade and environmental regulation. And I'm just going to do a little bit of scene setting for today, really. So what I'm really looking at is what this change was that happened in the last couple of years, how the rules around genetically modified food are changing, and what kind of questions, I suppose, that leads to for us as an organisation really concerned with the health of people and of nature. So up here, you'll see a little bit of a timeline. I went a bit slidey. Basically, there were EU regulations. The EU ended. There was a new act, as we've heard, and now we're expecting a statutory instrument to tell us how that new act works in all its detail and what that means for this new category of genetically modified food, precision-bred organisms. And the impact of all of this really is, firstly, we don't really know the detail because we don't have that secondary legislation yet. And secondly, what it means is that the overall impact, as you can see from this glorious flowchart here, you don't need to try and read it, is basically what this is telling you is that when someone thinks they have a precision-bred organism, they're asked the question, do you think you could have grown it traditionally? And then they're asked, do you think it's risky? And then if they've answered that they don't think it could be made by traditional methods, then it's GM. But if they've answered they think it could, then it's immediately a PBO. And if they don't think it's risky, then suddenly there's very little that they have to do in terms of monitoring and risk and traceability there. So what this flowchart is basically saying is there's a lot of power there with the people who are putting these products on the market to decide whether or not they're safe, which leads us to a few questions then about what this means in terms of the things we care about. So what this means for people in terms of how much food they'll have, how good that food will be for the planet, and importantly, how much power they'll have to decide what they grow, what they sell, and what they eat. And that's because for Friends of the Earth, the reward we're really looking for is an improving environment where climate, nature, and people are safe, where we all have enough food to eat, but not too much food to eat globally. And that food is reliably and resiliently getting to the people who need it without waste in a changing climate. We want that food to be produced and distributed in ways that don't pose harm to people, nature, or the climate. And we think that farmers and producers, not big business, not agri-tech, should have control over what they grow. And we as consumers should be able to know what we're eating, make informed choices. So that's really where I'm coming at the gene editing or the genetically modified organisms debate from. And I think the questions that come up for me in these three areas, and again, I've written them all on a slide, but mainly so that I don't have to read them all out and you can see them. In terms of sufficiency, the question I'd ask is GM of any kind the solution to a growing population? And I think my immediate answer would be, well, at the moment we know that if food waste were a country, it would be the third biggest emitter in the world. We know that we're growing enough food for a growing population. It's just not getting to the right places. And we know that it is about the right food getting to the right people. It's not about getting people low-value calories. Is it the solution to a changing climate? Again, I would question whether we can see any silver bullets for the climate, but particularly if we would see GM as being a one and only. And does it require actually less complex inputs, less fertilizer, less pesticides, less of the things we don't want on our food, which also can be reliably acquired cheaply from where you want to get them? And I think that brings up for me a lot of questions about control and whether when you have bought into a GM seed, you're then tied in to purchasing that every year, you're tied into using particular products on it, and you're tied into a particular supply chain. In terms of sustainability, I'm also left with the question, how does this new legislation protect what we have, people and nature, from unforeseen risk? This monitoring system based on essentially the word of producers and a very low level of information seems to me to offer a huge potential for unforeseen risk. It doesn't really seem to follow through on the precautionary principle, which has guided our environmental law for years. And I think there's a huge lack of detail that I'm sure we'll get into later around what monitoring, what traceability, What labelling? And I think the answer to labelling is very little. And what this means for how we can mitigate problems if they arise, fix them, and prevent them in the future. And we do know that there have been some examples of these unintended risks in various gene-edited and GM products around the world. We've seen cows with unintended antibiotic resistance. We've seen forms of fruit with unintended allergens. And we all remember what happened when everyone thought that neonics were the solution to growing great crops, and then all the bees began to decline. So this is something we've seen in other inputs as well. And finally, in terms of people power, what are the systems? And I don't think there are any, to be a bit of a, to ruin the surprise, in the Act at the moment that prevent big firms from funding, patenting, or controlling supply. And I think that does leave me with the question what that means for farmers who buy into this new system. It also makes me very worried, as I'm sure many organic farmers are, about how those producing to organic and agroecological standards are going to retain crop integrity, comply with their regulatory and accreditation requirements, and prevent, trace, or stop cross-contamination. And finally, I think it leaves me with the question, and I'm sure Dan will come on to this, of what routes there are for consumers to get information about what they're eating. If these things aren't traced, they're not labelled, we don't know. How are we going to make decisions for health or ethical reasons? How are we going to report or prevent harm? And how will the food regulators follow up on complaints or enforce against people? So I think those are some of the questions that I have been left with. And before I hand over to the technical bit of the panel, I'll give you a couple of brief conclusions, which I've probably hinted at a little already. I think if we're looking for the reward of enough food to eat, produced in ways that don't harm people or the planet, keeping the power with the people who grow and eat food and not those who profit from it, then we need to look back at the rationale of this Act and say the consultation process, the passage of this law itself didn't really address our questions about the need for or the appropriateness of GM solutions. So I'd be really interested to hear from other speakers and those in the room what you think the priority should be in helping farmers get the right amount of food to the right places and what those solutions really are. I think in terms of those processes laid out in the Act to give us confidence that people in the environment won't be harmed, that does leave me questioning how much power the secondary legislation is going to have to give us some positive answer to those questions and make sure that people and nature are safe from harm. It leaves me with a lot of questions about what's going to come up in the secondary legislation later in the year and what the next government will do, particularly in terms of extending this approach potentially to precision-bred animals. So I'm concerned about people and nature, and I wonder if you are too. And finally, as I said, the level of information required from those registering or bringing new products to the market is again low, and it's unclear how the remainder of the implementation process will be able to improve that. So I'll be interested to know if people present from the organic sector or consumer-facing bodies, how you might feel about that level of information, transparency, and what might happen for people and farmers if things go wrong. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Now over to Giles. Thanks, Kierra.
I just wanted to start off with this is the productivity of our cereals since since the year 1200, and this is showing you productivity per hectare for wheat, barley, and oats. And you can see that post 1900 there was a massive upswing in the productivity of our major cereals that we grow in the UK, leading to a quadrupling in our productivity for those cereals post 1900. Now, we know that the vast majority of that productivity gains for our major cereals is contributed by genetics. It's estimated approximately 70% of those gains that you see are because of genetics. That's entirely plant breeding in these instances, but genetic improvement of those cereals, 30% is agronomics. So I would say in the regen farming community, we are currently entirely focusing on agronomics, which over the last 100 years has contributed to 30% of productivity gains in our cereals. And there's a little bit, I would say, of a blind side to the contribution of genetics to the potential for driving our productivity in our major crops. For a regen farmer, you currently have the choice. You either go to an heirloom variety like spelt that was last improved in the early 1900s, which is generally underperforming, but because it's a niche market, you can economically, you make the economic gains even though it's not as productive. Or alternatively, you use a green revolution variety that's been bred for high intensive agriculture, and you have to use a green revolution variety in a regen farming system. Now, if we look at the two different farming systems, they're obviously radically different. And I really appreciate this image produced by Foxbarrow Farm. I think really demonstrates very clearly the difference between these two farming systems. All of our breeding and all of our genetic improvement for our crops has been on the high intensive agricultural input system on the left. And now we're trying to make this shift to a much more sustainable, regenerative mode of farming on the right. There's a lot of traits on the right that you need in your crops that are simply not present on the left. And so we've been breeding for a high intensive input system, and now we want to shift to this much more sustainable regen farming system. There's a lot of traits that I would call orphan traits that in the farming system on the left are completely absent from the farming system on the right. And examples of those are symbiotic associations, for instance, with mycorrhizal fungi, root systems that grow deeply and explore the soil in a complex way, whereas on the left, the root systems do not need to explore the system complex because we're adding the nutrients on the surface, and they can be quite shallow-rooted systems. So there's these traits that we've completely lost from our crop plants because we haven't been intentionally breeding or improving them. And these are orphan traits. I consider them orphan traits. We actually need to adapt our crop plants to a regen farming system to maximize the performance in a regen farming system. And I think if we're really serious about the opportunities in regen farming, we have to believe that this regen farming is going to take over not just this country, but the world. If we think that this is the best farming system, which I think it is, then we've got one to think in 20 or 30 years, this is the farming system that's going to be across the whole country. And then we can't simply be delivering spelt. We actually have to be delivering all of the needs of this, or the majority of the needs of this country's food and globally, with enough food that the population requires. So I would argue that we actually need to be bringing very seriously genetics of our crop plants into a regen farming system and designing our crop plants to maximize their performance in this new, much more sustainable farming system. So one of those orphan traits I'm talking about, I'm giving you an example here, is the mycorrhizal association. The roots get colonized extensively by these beneficial fungi. They form these amazing fungal intrusions into the cells. This is a conduit. This is an amazing capacity of plant microbial associations to capture nutrients like phosphates and nitrates, water, micronutrients, and deliver those to the crop plants. Incredibly useful in a regen farming system, and regen farmers are intentionally farming for mycorrhizal fungi. But the crop plants that we're currently using have not been bred to optimize this orphan trait. And to just demonstrate that, I'm showing you some data from rice here, but we know it's true for wheat and for maize. This is 200 accessions, different varieties of rice. And we're quantifying the benefit that that variety gets from the presence of mycorrhizal fungi. On the left are varieties that actually get a penalty, a 50% reduction in the shoot dry weight when they're colonized by mycorrhizal fungi. And it goes all the way to the right of that panel, where you can get varieties that have a 200% improvement when they're grown in the presence of mycorrhizal fungi. This genetic variation is happening in all of our crop plants, and it's happening because we haven't bred or intentionally improved for mycorrhizal fungi. So for a regen farmer who's actually farming with the intention of mycorrhizal fungi, you could be unintentionally planting a variety of wheat that actually has a penalty from mycorrhizal fungi. And clearly, if you're farming for mycorrhizal fungi, you want to be on the right-hand side of the panel and planting the variety that gets a 200% improvement from mycorrhizal fungi. So this is an example that simply shows you that there are critical traits that you guys as regen farmers want, that we've had a complete blind spot in our plant breeding for the last 100 years. And we need to bring these traits very rapidly into our farming systems. So we want, I would say, the technologies, which is genetics, principally here, that have underpinned these massive trait improvements, those technologies are agnostic. The fact that we as a society has chosen to apply those technologies to a high input, chemically driven farming system means that we get the varieties that we select under using those approaches. It doesn't mean we're limited by using those technologies purely for a high intensive farming system. And I think we can use these genetic technologies, both plant breeding, precision breeding, or gene editing, to massively, rapidly improve our crop plants to be adapted to the farming systems that you guys are using. And gene editing is an extraordinarily valuable and revolutionary technology that is transforming the natural sciences. It's getting a huge amount of application in medicine that is very widely accepted. And I think we are foolhardy as a community if we, out of fear, simply say this technology should not be used to genetically improve our crops for regen farming purposes. Let me just briefly explain what gene editing is. There's a protein called Cas9. It comes from bacteria. It has a little piece of RNA that you design that bit of RNA. It recognizes a very precise place in the genome because it's identical sequence to the RNA. That RNA brings the Cas9 protein to the genome, and at exactly the site where the RNA is, the Cas9 protein just cuts the DNA. That's all it does. It just cuts the DNA. DNA gets broken all the time in plants and all organisms. And we have to our cells repair that broken DNA. There's many reasons why our DNA gets broken. This is a way where you intentionally, at a very precise point, just cut the DNA with this protein. That's all you do. You cut the DNA. When the plant recognizes that the DNA is cut, it repairs it. But it doesn't know how to repair it because it's just a broken site. Doesn't know what was there. So it just repairs it, and it repairs it different ways. Sometimes it removes a base pair, sometimes it adds some extra base pairs. It just adds bits of DNA at exactly the site you cut. The reason this is extraordinarily useful is because it allows us as scientists to bring new natural diversity at precise points in genes that we know, in my case, are important for mycorrhizal fungi. And then we can select what of that new natural diversity is useful for our crops. So it allows me to combine a more conventional plant breeding approach with a very targeted plant breeding where I say, I know this gene is really important for mycorrhizae. I know I need more genetic diversity in this gene. And it allows me in a very precise and intentional way to breed at that precise point of that gene by bringing more genetic diversity. Once you brought that new genetic diversity, you get rid of the bacterial protein, it's completely gone. All that's left is the edit at the genome. Now, the guide RNAs are very precise, but they can, and I fully acknowledge, they can have off-site effects. They can bind a similar homologous gene. But now all we do is we just sequence the whole genome. It's so easy to do that. We sequence the entire genome of our gene editor crop, and I can tell you very precisely the changes that were made. And if there are off-target sequences or hits, we can see it. We can either breed them out, or we can just use a different guide that's more precise. It is an extremely precise technology, and it is very highly controlled. And I think if we really want to change our, bring genetics into our farming systems, into regen farming, it should be, and we want to do that very quickly. It needs to be a combination. I can't wait 100 years to have genetics for regen farming. Personally, I want those genetics now, or at least in the next 10 to 20 years. And so here is the genetic improvement of our wheat plants over the last 100 years. We need to redo this for regen farming, and I think we should be doing it in the next 10 years, not in the next 100 years. And if I can't use gene editing, you tie my hands so tightly that we'll be just waiting another 100 years for the genetics of regen farming.
Thank you, Giles. George.
Cool. Hello, everybody. I'm George Young. So I'm an organic beef suckler farmer. I'm actually an ex-arable farmer from South Essex. And I've been pretty outspoken about gene editing for some time, which I think is why I was asked to be here today. And actually, just to kind of get myself in the right mindset this morning, I did just re-listen to a video I recorded 3 or 4 years ago exactly about this. And it's interesting to listen to kind of previous views, which it's nice to listen to a video and think, oh, I'm still pretty much roughly on that same mindset. So when I was growing my arable crops a few years ago, I was spending an awful lot of time in working out kind of how to remove a lot of the agronomic inputs that we were using. So I was really trying to kind of figure out what to do to grow in, at the time, as close to an organic way as I could before I was actually an organic farmer. And so I was using examples like polycropping. I was doing diverse cropping as well. So I was introducing crops like buckwheat and hemp, which had really different kind of timings within their system to try and really get on top of things. And the main issues I was trying to tackle, besides grass weeds, because they're something that I don't think gene editing is going to help us with grass weeds, but the issues I was trying to tackle were things like fertility and obviously disease in the crops. And these are the things that I've often heard touted as the silver bullets that we're all looking for within gene editing. And actually, I'll be honest, Giles, that was an amazing presentation, because actually I've not heard people talk about gene editing to be used for these things. And if I'm honest, that's exactly what I think gene editing should be used for, if it should be used at all. So I think really for me, the problem is that when you look at gene editing from a farming perspective, ordinarily I'm going to discount what Giles said, because like I said, I've not heard someone talk about it in that regard before, and there's a lot of really good stuff there. So I'll talk about the things where I have heard gene editing used to be talked about before, so specifically about the disease and about being better at mining the fertility from the soil and natural fertility. The problem is that if we use these plants, what we're enabling us to do as farmers is we're enabling the status quo to continue. We're enabling the same style of agricultural system that the Green Revolution kind of started in the 1940s and 1950s. We're also tying ourselves quite often to other companies to buy stuff. And as every farmer in this room knows, machinery's gone up in price, land's going up in price, people are going up in price, so the labour on the farm's going up in price. Do we really want to be paying even more for the seed that we're putting in the ground at the same time? And ultimately, I look a lot at our food system. That's the main thing that I kind of spend my time thinking about. And within the food system, of course, as farmers, we often hear the term that we're feeding the world. It's a term I really hate. Because actually, ultimately, what a lot of what we're doing is we are producing calories to go in the belly of the world. What we're doing is producing a very unhealthy population. Actually, as farmers, we're not really the ones doing that. Just the produce that we create is going into really poor quality foodstuffs, which is making people unhealthy. So we're not ever looking at the kind of underlying entrenched costs of our food. All we're doing is we are trying as farmers to get our food price down as cheap as possible. This is something that governments have been driving farmers to do for many, many decades, because if you get a cheap food, then you have a very happy population. That's what always happens. If you ever look at the reasons for why we have civilization collapse, it's always to do with food price being expensive. As soon as you get riots, that's because food price is expensive. So governments want that food to be as cheap as possible. And ultimately, if there are entrenched other costs, such as a very high healthcare cost at the end of it, they don't necessarily mind about that. So my biggest fear is that if we carry on with gene editing from a disease perspective in crops, from a fertility perspective in crops. We're going to carry on doing exactly what we're doing at the moment. And we're not going to focus on the fact that there are agronomic ways to fix what we're doing with regards to those things at the moment. Now, I would very much come on to Giles here and say, well, actually, this is fantastic. If we genuinely can sequence the entire of a plant's DNA to know that the only change has been the absolute site that we're aiming to change, because I've heard plenty of situations where there have been off-site issues, which exactly with the antibiotic resistance coming in. I think that was in a pole gene going into cattle in America, and antibiotic resistance came in. But if we can guarantee that we've genuinely got only the changes we're looking for, because that slide you put up, Giles, of where wheat was up basically until about 1940, I've grown loads of those old wheat varieties, and yep, they do about 2 tonne a hectare, which is not great. And I struggle as a farmer as well. If you're growing only 2 tonne a hectare, and in an organic system I could be growing 5 tonne a hectare with a conventional variety, I struggle with the fact that I'm not being efficient on my ground. So it's about saying, well, where are we going to use gene editing to make these changes? And I'm very worried that, unfortunately, there are going to be scientific companies out there that don't have the kind of credibility of saying, actually, we're only going to fix the things that are going to fix human health. The last 50, 60, 70 years of agriculture have led to the fact that we've got a lot of intolerances in our food that has come about, I think, due to poor genetics. So consequently, what I don't want to end up with, because we're naturally hubristic as humans, and we always end up having to fix the problems we made for ourselves 50 years ago today. So what gene editing is kind of coming about today is, we messed up 50, 60, 70 years ago with the Green Revolution. How do we fix that now? What I don't want to end up in the place with is, in another 50 years' time, having to come up with yet another scientific discovery to fix issues that we've created today. So I think really it's, for me, it's a matter of caution, of saying, well, how are we going to use gene editing? How can we use it in a really sensible way and not make our lives necessarily easier as farmers, but make the food that we're creating better as farmers?
Thank you, George. Dan, over to you.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here. Excuse me. I guess my role here is to, and many of the issues, ethical issues and questions have already been picked up, but I'm not here to dive into the technicalities. But I guess just to kind of flag a few points, raise a few questions, building on what's already been discussed, and I've learnt a lot already. Hopefully you have too. I guess just briefly looking back, I don't want to spend very long looking back, but just picking up on something Kierra said earlier. We were quite vocal about the consultation process for this, in that not coming in saying being strongly pro, strongly anti necessarily, but just we felt that the consultation wasn't framed in a very helpful way. It was framed in here are the benefits of this bill coming in, and there was no sort of thought seemingly to the potential risks and concerns that many will have. So that's in terms of the framing of the consultation, how that was done, and how they listened or didn't listen to different public groups, different members of the public and civil society groups. I guess we had concerns with that in terms of process, first of all. But we've the act is now here, so we have to recognise that. We can debate till the end of the day, probably, the different pros and cons of this. But the act is here. Obviously, just a couple of clarification points. So this is in England we're talking about here. The Scottish and Welsh governments are not so keen. So it's messy. Again, the detail is very, very complex, messy, but there's the Internal Markets Act in terms of how this will work from a regulatory point of view. It gets very complicated and messy. In terms, and from an EU perspective, I'm not an expert on what's going on in the EU, but I understand, I think I'm right saying there was some delay yesterday. I'm looking at Giles, someone that may know, some delay in what's going on in terms of new genomic technologies in the EU. In terms of, I guess, ethical questions and points, I guess there's five, possibly six I want to raise. One is about values. So again, this has been touched on already, but this thing about what values do we want? What are the assumptions behind this? And some of the language around gene editing has been around the values of empowering and feeding the poor, feeding people, which again, and sometimes framed as feeding the world, which I'm not a fan of that, like George, fan of that framing. But we need to think about what are the values and assumptions behind gene editing. We need to think about, secondly, about control and profit, which has been touched on already. Who has power? Who benefits? Who might lose? Think about intellectual property rights. So who owns the technologies? What are the implications for farmers, for breeders, for growers, for others? Thirdly, kind of public funding and in what ways should, again, open question, what ways should public funding be supporting different technologies, including GE? What are the opportunity costs? And again, I think, to be fair, this is not a kind of anti-technology, anti-GE thing. This is a point we need to be, for any of the options that we're thinking about, we start with what's the problem we're trying to solve, what are the different options that might take us there, and so we need to think what are the different possibilities, the different options, what are the opportunity costs, instead of going hard down one route, perhaps at the expense of another, or do we need to keep all those options open? We can debate that. Fourthly, there's a question about the problem scale and scope. So how far can technologies like GE go towards solving a particular problem? Are they very singular in their focus about one particular thing, or are they looking at this more systemically? And it was refreshing to hear some of what Giles was talking about in terms of the potential to apply this in that transition to regenerative agroecological that many in this room will be, or probably everyone in this room, I suspect, will be keen on. Fifth point is about containability. So again, it's been talked about already, so I won't go on about that. The off-site effects, spillover effects, potential unintended consequences. So if there is something that's brought in around, insect resistance or herbicide resistance, herbicide tolerant crop, the intended consequences there is obviously to reduce or eliminate the use of pesticides or herbicides, which I think we all agree is a good thing. But obviously the unintended consequences, we don't know what they will be. Some will argue that loss of insects and seeds as foods for birds may lead to species extinction, etc. So there's those kind of thinking about the broader system for this. And again, to be fair, we need to apply this not just to GE but to the other alternatives as well. And the last point I'll make for now is, because I'm really keen to hear from people in the room, I think there are lots of experts in the room, is, again, it was touched on before, but this thing about transparency, labelling, the act is here. We're going to see it on gene editing in plants is coming through. Farmed animals next, and Nuffield Council on Bioethics has done some brilliant work on the ethical questions around that, which is I recommend looking at. But on sort of transparency and labelling, I'm firmly of the opinion that people have a right to know what's in their food, so that we should have labelling, which is not the current government position. But there's a huge number of ethical questions and debates this raises. I say this is not about, there's no such thing as technology good or technology bad, it's how it's applied that's critical. So we need to get into the real nuance and look at it on a case-by-case basis. But looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you to everyone on the panel. I mean, it's really interesting that there clearly is a consensus among everyone on the panel that we do need to move towards a regenerative system for people and planet. So to me, that the question really is whether getting there more slowly poses a bigger risk to people and planet than getting there more quickly via precision breeding techniques. That seems to me to be the real question here. Wonder if anyone on the panel wants to come back on that. Which is the bigger risk, getting there slowly or getting there quickly via PBOs?
I would question slightly the assumption that we will get there quickly via PBOs. I think, a few of us have talked about the risk of thinking that anything is a silver bullet, for one, and so thinking that getting towards more regenerative farming can be achieved or will be achieved solely or even primarily through gene-edited crops, I think is questionable. And I think there's also a worry that even if everything we had here and saw on the slides was true, and that these crops gene-edited organisms would bring us more quickly towards a system where more people can farm regeneratively. My question is, what happens 10 years down the road when we find an unintended consequence of that, and how far back does that put us? So does that mean we've moved more quickly if we move incredibly quickly with very little regulation, with no traceability now, and particularly with no monitoring of harm, and then we have to unpick it all in 10 years? So will that be faster, and will it be better?
Okay, thanks. Giles?
So I would say that's messaging of fear. And I don't think we want to really be in a place of avoidance because of fear. Actually, I think we should be ambitious with regards to the farming systems we're doing. And I'm certainly not saying gene editing is a silver bullet. Absolutely not. It is one extremely valuable tool in the toolbox alongside conventional breeding. There's no way we're just going to gene edit our totality of our crops. Absolutely not. It's a combination of conventional breeding and precision breeding that together really get us much more intentionally and much quicker towards the crop plants that I think we need as a regenerative farming community. And the unintended consequences, we have the ability to know precisely what's happening in these plants. And you see, these days, we can sequence a genome for £100. It's super cheap. It's super quick. You can completely resequence the genome. You know exactly what's happened in the genetics of that genome. So I can tell you precisely if the only changes at that gene or if there's any other changes. But the main point here is all gene editing is doing is just bringing new natural diversity at a precise point in a gene, which is already happening anyway, all the time. DNA breaks all the time, and new genetic diversity is brought in naturally all the time. We're just doing it in an intentional way at a precise location. That's the only difference. The thought that this is fear, that this is something we should be fearful of, if you're fearful of that, you should be fearful of natural diversity. This is not something to be fearful of. And I think it will hold us back immensely if we approach this place always from a place of fear. The technology itself is agnostic. It's how you apply that technology. If we apply that technology to a high chemical farming system, then we get what we ask for. We get crops that perform in high chemical farming system. If we apply that technology in a regen farming system, when we get the crops that are going to perform in that farming system. The technology is agnostic. It's how we choose to apply that technology. And I would say the problem right now is that there's a juggernaut of public funding and industry funding that's sitting behind the chemical farming system. And you guys are just missing out on all of that. There's no genetic improvement for regen farming at the moment. Nothing. Not conventional breeding or not gene editing. That's the travesty, I would say, that actually you need that juggernaut of activity to be focused on a more sustainable farming system. And I really think we will be utterly foolhardy to hold our hands behind our backs and block gene editing as a route to get to this place where we need to be.
George is a farmer.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because I think for me it's about looking completely differently actually to talking about gene editing like this, but instead saying, well, let's look at the food system and look at the entrenched costs on that and the health implications of that, and saying, well, we know we've got a really unhealthy society. We know that our NHS is in an absolute pickle because you read everyone's manifestos at the moment, and they're all talking about that. And they're talking about the level of funding that's required for that. My really big issue is that, yes, we know that gene editing could be used to make healthier crops. But if you talk to any politician, unfortunately, they're not necessarily the smartest people quite often. And every single person in government always wants a nice, simple solution as to how to do things. Now, the problem is when you then boil these things down, gene editing appears like the simple solution to enable to continue what is currently happening. And unfortunately, gene editing won't just be used in a good way, which is how Giles is talking about. It will be used in a really crap way as well, in a way that continues to proliferate poor health. Now, as it happens at the moment, as most farmers, all the farmers sitting in the room today, most of you will know that, we're at quite a precipice in kind of growing crops and rearing animals because we are dealing with climate change. So the worry is that we've got this really simple solution which will help us along with that. Whereas actually there are more complex solutions that lead to changing our entire food system, which means that it then leads to a healthier population. What I am most worried about is not the fear necessarily of gene editing coming in. It's the fear of not having the impetus that we currently have with a broken cropping system, which will help us fix a broken food system. If we're not careful, this will come in and will fix our broken cropping system and enable our crap food system to continue at the moment. That's my biggest worry.
Yeah, I largely agree with that. Briefly, because I know we want to get questions. My top line take is we need an urgent just transition. We sometimes need to pause and stop before we rush headlong into something. And again, not just in the context of gene editing. That could be across anything. We just need to think, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What are the different options? And then spend more time on the pausing and thinking about that. That doesn't mean being paralyzed and never doing anything, but it's just thinking things through before doing things that might lock us into a particular path. And again, it's not gene editing specific, just a general thing. We need to avoid lock-ins. We need to be, in the future, we need to have flexibility. We need to be flexible. We need to be, in order to be resilient. So that's a very generic point. But yeah, urgency, but not rushing, if that makes sense.
Wise words. Okay, right. Over to the audience. Gentleman in the cap at the front here. Can everyone please wait till they've got the microphone? If you're going to make a statement, please not too long and preferably lots of questions for the panelists.
Yeah, thank you. Tom Allen Stevens, British On-Farm Innovation Network. We know quite a lot about what our members who are farmers who do their own farm trials feel about gene editing. We've surveyed them twice. And there's a whole spectrum of views on this, right from those who are really keen to get them on their farm to those who have got serious reservations. And actually, George, you illustrated a lot of the sort of concerns that our farmers have got. But the overriding things that they found was they want to be more informed about gene editing, and they want to be able to have the opportunity to grow them in a research environment, in non-commercial background, so that we can raise and answer exactly the questions that Dan was raising there. And that process starts now. We're already multiplying up the first 3 cereals from Rothamsted and from John Innes Centre. We're going to be bringing them onto commercial farms. Growers are going to be growing them in England in 2025-26 growing season. And the discussion around that starts on the Rothamsted stand today. We've got a lunch at 12 o'clock. You're all invited to come. But the question I want to ask is, should they be prevented from doing that? Should we prevent the research going into these gene-edited crops? Should we prevent them coming onto commercial farms in a research environment, in a non-commercial environment, to see what they do and to answer these questions? Because I feel, Kierra, you would like to prevent that.
Well, I'll let Kierra answer that for herself.
Oh, I'm going to shock you now. So we've never had a system in the UK where GM is completely banned. There has always been a system for allowing genetically modified crops to be grown in research environments. There has always been a system. You're shaking your head, but there is, because we go in and we look at the field trials and we see the evidence that's been submitted to DEFRA, and we see the evidence of people doing this research already and for the previous decades.
Sorry, let Kierra answer, please.
So I'm not looking at whether or not the food system is broken. And in fact, I agree with everyone here. The food system is broken. We do need to change it. But I think in terms of should we allow people to look at ways to change that are safe, that are precautionary, and that put the reward of healthy people, healthy nature, and no unintended consequences, not only within the genome, but in terms of the knock-on effects on ecosystems, on biodiversity. I think those need to be the key. And, research, properly moderated, transparent, with public engagement and participation, great, 100% behind that.
Thank you. Giles, have you got anything to add?
Well, obviously, I would massively support doing the research, but I think that the question that Tom has raised is very valuable. We actually just need to get these out in the field and see if they do perform in these different farming systems, and we certainly should not have a barrier. But I would say the position that Kierra takes, although she's saying we should be doing research, in fact, the position of anti-technology has a huge impact on us as researchers, because it means the public funds don't come in we don't see the public funds, we don't see the opportunity to move forwards, to actually get the field trials. It is a limiting position. You cannot expect an anti-technology position to be held and then expect the technology to just be available to the researchers and available to use. There has to be intention and goodwill in order to see that technology really being properly supported and funded and streamlined into getting into farmers' fields to be tested. So don't presume that just having an anti-technology position means the technology will be getting on, because it's clearly not the case.
You mean technology being applied to more regenerative systems?
Or even in a research purposes.
Flowing into other areas of
if
crop
society
science,
says this technology is bad, then it's not available. It's much harder for us as researchers to do it. It's just it's a reality.
Okay. Gentleman with the black hoodie on. I think it's black. Hard Rock. Please wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Charlie, I'm a sustainability consultant. Giles, I found your presentation very compelling. I'm just curious in terms of if the same companies, the companies that have in our sort of industrial agriculture system, the same companies that have the resources to develop lots of GM crops are also the ones selling fertilizers and pesticides to go along with that. Is there not an incentive to, invariably bake in high dependency on these things that regenerative farmers want to get rid of? And how do we sort of change that system and those incentives?
Yeah. So we have a market failure at the moment. We have a agricultural sector that's focused entirely on high input systems and developing the crops for those high input systems. Yet there's a desire on government and society to shift to something more sustainable. But currently, you guys are not a big enough buying power to persuade the Syngentas or BASFs of the world to actually make products for regen farmers, because the majority of farmers are using the high chemical input system. So we have a market failure where the transition is not there. And I think personally, my view on this is that we should be seeing a lot more public investment in developing those crops to recognize that market failure, to facilitate the development of the crops for regen farming and more sustainable farming systems. At the moment, much of the public funds is also focused on the high input, high chemical farming. And so there's a sort of juggernaut of public and private sector supporting one side of farming systems, and the other side of the farming systems, the regen, is mostly just absent. And so there is absolutely a market failure. It doesn't mean that because there's a market failure, the system is not repairable, and there are routes way to address a market failure, and one of them is where you put your public investment.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to come in on that point? No? Okay.
Okay. So if we edit a gene and we make a gene that nature's never seen before, even if we look at the entire sequence and say we've achieved what it is we set out to achieve, when we introduce that into the world and nature, how do we guarantee that that isn't a chimera for some other species in the environment a little bit down the line? And then how does nature deal with that? Because if we're randomly gene editing all the time, this must happen in nature, but nature stops other species being taken out. So how do we guarantee that with what we're talking about?
I feel like I'm answering all the questions, but so this does happen all the time in nature. It's continuously happening. We're getting new natural diversity happening all the time, but the genome is enormous, and that natural diversity is happening sort of equally across all of that genome. So out in nature, mutations are happening, and then you have natural selection that out in nature says, oh, this one's might be a little better, so therefore it does a little better, makes more seed, and the next progeny do well. Yeah, so but it's a totally random. All gene editing does is bring that natural diversity, instead of being randomly across the whole genome, to a very precise place that we know is a gene that, for instance, is important for mycorrhizal fungi. So it's just bringing in new genetic diversity that's already happening everywhere into a very precise location where we know it's important and valuable. So it's not, and a chimera, species cross with each other. It's not, a gene edit won't get into another species because it has to be sexually compatible for that to be the case. So all gene editing is doing is really just speeding up the process of natural diversity and of natural selection and mutation that's already happening, and just doing it in a very precise location.
Thanks. Unless anyone wants to come in on that.
I mean, I can.
Go on, Kierra.
Sorry. I just want to go back to the time issue here, because I do think that's really important, because we can say that nature changes all the time. We can say that nature changes in many diverse ways. What we can't say is what the response is of nature to changes that may commercially spread very quickly, become very prominent very quickly, and we may have many quite similar changes coming onto the market very quickly. If it were to happen that in nature a particular organism were to change to be resistant to a certain insect, that might have a very minor impact because it would be localized. That may not carry on into future generations. It may not happen ever at the same time. If that happens in a commercial way, and we see that insect decimated across countries, there is a much bigger impact. And if that's happening to various insects for various GM reasons, I think that leads to the problem you're talking about. So there is something about the faster we move. It's not about fear. It is about just considering the cumulative impact of lots of these things and wanting to do it right.
That's a really important point. Do you want to come back on that, Giles? Because is there a risk of a cumulative impact here, and can we realistically have a regulatory framework that prevents that?
I mean, I guess the issue that Kierra is raising is just as relevant for conventional plant breeding as it is for
we're seeing lots of problems,
breeding.
Aren't we, with the impact of agriculture on our ecosystems?
When you bring a new variety and you grow it in monoculture across the whole country, then intrinsically any issue with that variety is going to be amplified. But that's no different with gene editing as it is with conventional plant breeding. It's not something we would necessarily currently consider a problem in bringing a new variety. I actually think in the regen farming system, because you're actually moving away from monocultures and more into mixtures, you're already avoiding a degree of that. What is the consequence of this one variety planted as a monoculture across the whole country? That I fully acknowledge, and I acknowledge Kierra's points there, but I don't think that's a gene editing issue. That's just a new variety issue, and gene editing is a route to making new varieties, but you can do it by conventional plant breeding. There are sometimes consequences of planting that variety as a monoculture across the globe. I think actually regen farming is addressing that point right already and avoiding that issue of a sort of monoculture approach to farming.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We've got one more question, I think. Lady in the white.
Thanks for very well-honed arguments on this panel, which I'm much appreciating and learning from. I just wanted to go back to the previous question about market failure in terms of the gentleman in the black rock hoodie over there. The issue, I come from Kenya, and there we've got a huge fertilizer lobby that puts presidents in power, that has farmers on 1-year terms of fertilizer with seeds that they must buy, and a law which prevents farmers from selling seeds to each other even. How do we ensure going forward, I appreciate this argument is about the UK, and obviously that needs to happen, but I'm just interested in any responses to what could Britain do to make sure that we, by becoming more regenerative here, aren't simply displacing the problem elsewhere, because that's what these big companies will do. Thank you.
Do you want to come in on that?
I don't think I've got a good answer to that. I mean, yeah, I think it's a good point, and it's a broader point than GE as well about offshoring our impacts. I think there's something about there's still a bit of a kind of neo-colonial attitude that we, among some people, not just amongst yourself, but like that we as the UK can kind of teach the world what to do. And I know that's not what you're saying, but there's something about being humble about and not suggesting that we have all the answers. We don't. I don't know. I think there's other countries are thinking about this and moving forward on this or exploring this as well. So there is a kind of global north, global south thing, but I think we need to remember we've got a lot to learn from the global south as well. Just briefly on another point, just while I'm here, I know we haven't got much time, but just on the kind of broader research point that was raised earlier, I'm a firm believer in publicly funded research should prioritise public good over private profit. So that's picking up a separate point, but just to throw that in the mix in the last couple of minutes.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I mean, it is a much more general question about the impact of potentially offshoring if we move to more generative systems here. Kierra, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think it's one that could be at a consumer level in the UK, partly addressed by proper labelling so that there is an ability for manufacturers, for suppliers, for consumers to know what they're selling and eating. And so for people to be able to ensure that things that we're importing and eating are produced in the kind of ways we'd like to see things produced in the UK and make that choice. I think it's also about technology transfer from the UK to other nations around the world. And I think it's about moving from a system where we're making trade deals to try and increase our export potential and increase imports of cheap goods to trading agreements where what we're looking at are how we, alongside trade, how we support other nations with being sustainable and resilient for trade in the future, which means things like climate finance. It means things like work on adaptation. It means cooperation. So it's not all about telling everyone else what to do very much. It's about making sure we all work together to grow the food that we all want to eat.
Agreed. Excellent. Right, I could listen to the panelists all day, but I'm going to get in trouble if I don't wrap this up. So thank you, guys. That was a brilliant conversation. Round of applause.